It's a Sunday morning in Birmingham, Alabama, 1995. The parking lot at First Baptist Church is so packed that volunteers are directing traffic with orange cones and hand signals. Inside, every pew is filled. The choir is 70 voices strong. And when the pastor asks the congregation to turn to their neighbors and shake hands, the entire sanctuary erupts in a wave of motion and sound. Flash forward to that same church, same Sunday morning, 2024. There are maybe 200 people scattered across a space built for 2,000. The choir has dwindled to 15 voices. The youth pastor position has been vacant for 18 months. And in the parking lot where cars once fought for spaces, weeds are growing through cracks in the asphalt. This isn't just one church's story. It's the story of thousands of churches across the American South, a region that for generations was known as the Bible Belt, where church attendance wasn't just common, it was expected. It was part of your identity, woven into the fabric of community life as surely as high school football and sweet tea. But something has shifted. The numbers tell a story that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago. In 1972, 92% of people in Alabama identified as Christian. By 2022, that number had dropped to 73%. In Georgia, church membership has fallen from 88% in the early 1970s to just 61% today. The Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, and historically the dominant religious force across Dixie, lost 2 million members between 2006 and 2020. Think about that, 2 million people. That's more than the entire population of Houston, Texas. But the raw statistics don't capture what this actually looks like on the ground. Drive through any small town in Mississippi, Tennessee, or North Carolina, and you'll see them. Church buildings with faded paint and broken windows, for sale signs planted in front of structures that once hosted hundreds of worshipers every week. In rural Georgia alone, more than 1,500 churches have closed in the past 2 decades. These aren't just buildings, they're landmarks, repositories of community memory, places where generations of families were baptized, married, and mourned. Their emptying represents a seismic shift in Southern culture that goes far beyond religion. The South's relationship with Christianity wasn't just spiritual, it was political, social, and economic. For most of the 20th century, if you wanted to do business in a Southern town, you went to church. If you wanted to run for office, you'd better be seen in a pew. The church was where deals were made, where social networks were formed, where young people met future spouses. A pastor's endorsement could make or break a political career. Church leadership and community leadership were often synonymous. But that power structure is crumbling, and the reasons why read like a detective story with multiple suspects, each playing their part in reshaping the religious landscape of the South. Let's start with demographics, because nothing stays the same, no matter how permanent it seems. The Great Migration that saw millions of Black Americans leave the South for northern and western cities between 1916 and 1970 is now running in reverse. Since 2000, the South has experienced massive population growth, but it's not coming from within. It's coming from migrants arriving from the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West Coast. People who didn't grow up with Southern church culture, who don't have generations of family buried in the cemetery behind the local Methodist church, who don't feel that cultural obligation to attend services. Between 2010 and 2020, Texas gained nearly 4 million new residents. Florida added 2.7 million. North Carolina brought in over 1 million. These newcomers are reshaping the region's identity. But it's not just about where people are coming from. It's about who they are. The South is getting younger, more educated, and more diverse. In cities like Atlanta, Charlotte, Austin, and Nashville, you now have large populations of young professionals, many working in tech, finance, and healthcare, industries that didn't have a significant Southern presence 2 generations ago. And here's what the data shows about younger Americans. They're less religious than any generation in American history. A 2021 Pew Research study found that only 31% of adults born after 1996 describe themselves as religious, compared to 57% of baby boomers. In North Carolina's Research Triangle, home to Duke University, UNC Chapel Hill, and NC State, regular church attendance among residents under 40 is below 25%. These aren't people who left the church. Many of them never went in the first place. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the stories that shape our world. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it right now? Are you in the Bible Belt yourself, maybe seeing these changes firsthand? Or are you watching from somewhere else, curious about what's happening in the American South? Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where our community spans across the globe. The Latino population boom across the South is another factor that's rewriting the religious map. Between 2000 and 2020, the Hispanic population in the South grew by 115%. States like North Carolina saw their Latino populations triple. In Georgia, Hispanic residents now make up 10% of the total population. Now, you might think more people means more church members, and in some cases, you'd be right. Catholic churches in many southern states have seen growing attendance as Latino families have moved in. But here's the twist. Many of these newer Catholic parishes exist parallel to, rather than integrated with, the traditional Protestant power structure that dominated Southern culture for so long. A Catholic church in Arkansas doesn't carry the same historical social weight as the Baptist church that's been the center of town life since 1872. The traditional Protestant establishment isn't gaining these new arrivals. In fact, they're often competing with entirely different religious institutions and traditions. And speaking of Catholics, we need to talk about a religious reality that would shock Southerners from 50 years ago. For most of Southern history, being Catholic meant being other, being suspect, being potentially un-American. When John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, his Catholicism was a massive issue, particularly in the South, where many Protestants openly questioned whether a Catholic could truly be loyal to American democracy or would instead answer to the Pope. Kennedy had to give a famous speech to Protestant ministers in Houston, explicitly addressing these concerns, saying, "I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president who happens also to be Catholic." He lost most of the southern states anyway, though he narrowly carried Texas. Fast forward to today. Louisiana, a southern state, is 40% Catholic. It has been for generations, but Louisiana was always seen as the exception, the weird cousin with its French heritage and Mardi Gras traditions. What's changed is that Catholics now make up significant minorities in nearly every southern state, and in many urban areas they rival or exceed Protestant congregations in size and influence. This hasn't led to Catholic dominance, but to religious pluralism, a marketplace of faiths rather than a Protestant monopoly. Then there's the internet and the information revolution, which has been nothing short of cataclysmic for traditional religious authority. For generations, the pastor was often the most educated person in many southern communities, especially in rural areas. He interpreted scripture, provided moral guidance, and served as a connection to a broader intellectual world. If you had questions about theology, about the Bible, about how to live a Christian life, you asked your pastor. That monopoly on religious knowledge is completely gone. Today, anyone with a smartphone can access thousands of sermons from celebrity preachers, read multiple Bible translations with scholarly commentary, join online theological discussion groups, or encounter critical perspectives on Christianity they would never have heard from a local pulpit. A teenager in rural Mississippi can now watch atheist debates on YouTube, read about biblical contradictions on Reddit, or explore Buddhism, Islam, or secular philosophy without ever leaving her bedroom. The local church no longer controls the information environment. But let's dig deeper into something more uncomfortable, something that's harder to quantify but absolutely crucial to understanding this story: the moral credibility crisis. For institutions that position themselves as moral authorities, the guardians of family values and community standards, the past 2 decades have been devastating. The Catholic Church's sexual abuse scandals are well known, and while the Catholic Church wasn't historically the dominant force in the South, those scandals affected all Christian institutions by association. But Southern Protestant churches have faced their own reckoning. Between 2019 and 2022, a series of investigations revealed that the Southern Baptist Convention, which represents over 13 million members across the South, had spent decades covering up sexual abuse cases. An independent investigation released in 2022 found that SBC leaders had maintained a secret list of credibly accused abusers and had actively worked to protect accused pastors rather than victims. The report detailed case after case of church leaders dismissing, minimizing, and even blaming victims who came forward. For an institution that had spent decades proclaiming itself the guardian of traditional family values and Christian morality, this was catastrophic. And the timing couldn't have been worse because these revelations came during and after the Cerritos Me Too movement, when cultural attitudes about institutional abuse and cover-ups were undergoing a massive shift. Younger Southerners, particularly women, watched their churches respond to these scandals with everything from defensiveness to denial, and many of them simply walked away. Emily Johnson, a former worship leader at a large Baptist church in Tennessee, told a reporter in 2023, "I realized the church wasn't interested in protecting people like me. It was interested in protecting its power. Once you see that, you can't unsee it." The abuse scandals weren't the only moral credibility crisis. Southern churches' deep entanglement with partisan politics has driven away members who felt their faith was being reduced to a political identity. For most of American history, there was a general understanding that while churches and clergy could speak on moral issues, they shouldn't become overtly partisan political organizations. That understanding has collapsed. The rise of the religious right in the 1980s, originally focused on issues like abortion and school prayer, has evolved into something much more comprehensive. By the 2000s, and especially during the Trump era, many evangelical churches in the South had become essentially Republican organizing centers. A 2019 study found that in over 40% of Southern evangelical churches, pastors made explicit candidate endorsements from the pulpit, despite this technically violating their tax-exempt status. Churches hosted voter registration drives that specifically targeted conservative voters. Political messaging became indistinguishable from religious messaging. For some churchgoers, this was exactly what they wanted, a full fusion of their religious and political identities. But for others, particularly younger evangelicals who didn't share their parents' political views, it was alienating. Sarah Pruitt, who grew up in a Southern Baptist church in South Carolina, described her experience. "I went to church one Sunday in 2016, and the pastor spent 45 minutes of his sermon talking about Hillary Clinton and the evils of liberalism. He barely mentioned Jesus. I realized I didn't need to wake up early on Sunday to hear a political rally. I could get that anywhere." This wasn't an isolated experience. Surveys show that among Americans under 40 who were raised evangelical but have left, nearly 70% cite the church's political involvement as a major factor in their departure. The church's moral authority was premised on being different from the world, being above politics, being focused on eternal rather than temporal concerns. When that distinction collapsed, so did the reason many people saw for treating religious institutions as special. The Trump era in particular created a fracture that many Southern churches still haven't recovered from. White evangelical support for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020 exceeded 80% in most Southern states. For church leaders who had spent decades preaching about character, virtue, and the importance of personal morality, supporting a thrice-married casino owner who bragged about sexual assault required some significant theological gymnastics. Some pastors managed it by focusing on judicial appointments and policy positions. Others simply went all in, declaring Trump a flawed vessel, chosen by God for a divine purpose. But many churchgoers, especially those who had internalized all those lessons about character and integrity, couldn't reconcile it. They looked at their pastors and church leaders defending behavior they would have condemned in any other context, and they felt betrayed. The hypocrisy was too glaring to ignore. What profession are you in, by the way? I ask because I've noticed that viewers from different fields bring fascinating perspectives to these historical and cultural discussions. Teachers see the educational dimensions, healthcare workers often comment on the community health aspects, business people understand the economic angles. Whatever your profession, I'd love to hear how this topic connects to your own experience. Leave a comment and let us know. Let's talk about the economics of church decline, because this isn't just about belief, it's about money. Churches are expensive to run. A traditional Southern church might have a full-time pastor, a youth minister, a music director, support staff, a building that requires constant maintenance, utilities, insurance, and program costs. In the days when hundreds or thousands of members attended weekly and gave regularly, this was manageable. But as congregations shrink, the math stops working. A church that's built for 800 people but now has 80 regular attendees is trapped. The building still needs heat in winter and air conditioning in summer. The roof still leaks. The sound system still breaks. But the income has fallen by 90%. Many churches find themselves in a slow-motion financial crisis, cutting staff, eliminating programs, and deferring maintenance until the building itself becomes a deterrent to new members. Who wants to join a church that feels like it's dying? Some Southern churches have tried to adapt by consolidating. In 2018, 5 small Baptist churches in rural Kentucky merged into one congregation, sharing a single pastor and meeting in the building that was in the best condition. They sold the other 4 properties, using the proceeds to renovate the remaining church and fund programs. But consolidation is emotionally wrenching. Each of those churches had histories stretching back over a century. Families had attended the same church for 5 generations. Telling people that their church, the place where their grandparents were married, where their parents are buried in the adjacent cemetery, is closing feels like cultural erasure. Many resist even when the alternative is slowly bleeding out over another decade. The result is that across the South, there are still thousands of churches operating with aging, declining congregations, postponing the inevitable. The megachurch phenomenon offers an interesting counterpoint, but it actually reinforces rather than contradicts the story of decline. Yes, churches like North Point Community Church in Georgia, with over 40,000 weekly attendees, or Second Baptist Church in Houston, with over 80,000 members, are thriving. But these massive institutions are succeeding by drawing members away from smaller churches. It's religious consolidation, the Walmartization of Christianity. People who might have attended a neighborhood church with 200 members now drive 30 minutes to a megachurch. That offers professional quality music, sophisticated children's programs, multiple service times, and a charismatic celebrity pastor they can watch on stadium-sized screens. This creates a religious landscape where a handful of enormous churches thrive, while hundreds of small and medium-sized churches slowly die. The total number of active churchgoers isn't increasing. It's just being concentrated in fewer locations. And here's something the megachurches understand that traditional Southern churches often don't. Cultural change is real, and you either adapt or become irrelevant. Many megachurches have essentially created Christian-themed entertainment complexes. They offer rock concert quality worship experiences, complete with professional lighting, fog machines, and instrumental performances that rival secular concerts. They've built coffee shops, bookstores, and recreation facilities. They frame their messaging in therapeutic self-help terms rather than traditional fire and brimstone preaching. They're highly conscious of branding and marketing. In other words, they've accepted that they're competing for people's time and attention in a marketplace crowded with other options, and they've designed their offerings accordingly. Traditional Southern churches, rooted in a time when church attendance was a given rather than a choice, often struggle with this market-based approach. Many see it as cheapening the faith, selling out to consumerism. But from the perspective of someone deciding how to spend their Sunday morning, the traditional church often just can't compete. Race and the legacy of segregation add another complex layer to this story. Southern churches weren't just religious institutions. They were key players in maintaining racial hierarchies. During the Jim Crow era, white churches overwhelmingly supported segregation, often providing theological justifications for racial separation. When the civil rights movement challenged this system, most white Southern churches opposed it. In Birmingham in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his famous Letter from a Birmingham Jail in response to white clergy who had criticized his direct action campaigns as too confrontational and poorly timed. King expressed profound disappointment with white moderate clergy, writing, "I have watched many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which makes a strange, unbiblical distinction between body and soul, between the sacred and the secular." That history hasn't been forgotten, and it hasn't been adequately addressed by most white Southern churches. Today, Sunday morning remains the most segregated hour in America. Churches in the South, like churches everywhere, are overwhelmingly racially homogeneous. But younger generations, particularly in diverse urban areas, are increasingly uncomfortable with this. They've grown up in integrated schools, work in diverse workplaces, and many have interracial friend groups and relationships. Walking into an all-white church in 2024 feels anachronistic to many of them, like stepping back in time. Some churches have made efforts toward integration, but it's been slow and often superficial. A church might have a handful of black members, but still be led entirely by white clergy, still sing exclusively white musical traditions, and still maintain a culture that feels fundamentally white. For Black Southerners, the church remains central to community life in many cases, but Black churches operate largely separately from the white Protestant institutions that historically held regional power. The decline we're talking about is primarily happening in white churches. The issues around LGBTQ inclusion have been particularly divisive and have accelerated departures among younger Southerners. For generations, Southern churches were nearly universally opposed to homosexuality, treating it as both sinful and unmentionable. But as American culture has shifted rapidly on LGBTQ rights, particularly following the Supreme Court's 2015 decision legalizing same-sex marriage nationwide, Southern churches have faced a moment of reckoning. Some have maintained traditional teachings, some have moved toward inclusion, and many have tried to stake out middle positions that satisfy no one. What's clear is that this issue has driven away both conservative members who think churches are compromising biblical truth and progressive members, often younger, who can't reconcile their faith with institutions they see as bigoted. A 2022 study found that among Americans under 35 who left evangelical churches, opposition to the church's stance on homosexuality was the single most commonly cited reason, mentioned by 63% of respondents. The pandemic accelerated trends that were already underway. When churches closed their buildings in March 2020, many members discovered they didn't miss it as much as they thought they would. Churches scrambled to set up online streaming, with varying degrees of technical competence. Some adapted well, but many struggled with the technology and the format. Watching a pastor on a laptop just doesn't create the same communal experience as being physically present with hundreds of other worshipers. When churches reopened, many found that a significant percentage of their congregations simply didn't come back. They'd gotten out of the habit, or they'd realized their lives worked fine without Sunday services, or they'd found other things to do with their time. A survey of Southern churches in late 2021 found that on average, congregations were running at about 70% of their pre-pandemic attendance. Some churches recovered those losses over the following years, many didn't. The pandemic also exacerbated political divisions within congregations. Churches that refused to close or that reopened quickly attracted some members but alienated others. Churches that maintained strict safety protocols were accused by some members of lacking faith. Masks became a symbol of broader cultural divisions, and churches found themselves navigating conflicts that had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with partisan politics. Many churches lost members to both sides of these disputes, people who felt their church had either been too cautious or not cautious enough. The wounds from those conflicts are still healing in many congregations. What about the theological shifts that have made traditional Southern religion less appealing to many younger believers? For generations, Southern Christianity was characterized by certainty. The Bible was inerrant, the way to salvation was clear, moral boundaries were well defined, and questions were generally discouraged. This worked well in a culturally homogeneous environment where everyone shared the same assumptions. But in an age of religious pluralism, global communication, and easy access to diverse perspectives, that certainty has become harder to maintain. Young people are exposed to other religions, to sophisticated atheist arguments, to biblical scholarship that challenges literal interpretations. Many find the old certainties unconvincing but aren't offered more nuanced theological frameworks within their churches. The choice becomes stark. Accept teachings that seem intellectually untenable or leave. Many choose the latter. Progressive Christianity has emerged as an alternative for some, churches and faith communities that embrace biblical criticism, that affirm LGBTQ members, that focus on social justice rather than personal salvation. But these progressive congregations, while growing in some Southern cities, haven't replaced the losses from traditional churches. They remain relatively small and appeal to a specific demographic, generally educated urban liberals. They haven't provided a mass alternative that can compete with traditional Southern religion's historical dominance. The rise of the knowns, people who identify as religiously unaffiliated, is perhaps the most significant trend reshaping the Southern religious landscape. Nationally, knowns now make up about 30% of the American population, the largest single religious category. In the South, the percentage is lower but growing rapidly. In 2007, about 11% of Southerners identified as religiously unaffiliated. By 2022, that number had nearly tripled to 28%. These aren't all atheists. Many describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, or they maintain private beliefs but don't participate in organized religion. But the effect is the same. They're not in church pews, they're not giving financially, they're not sending their kids to youth groups. They're opting out of institutional religion entirely. This brings us to something subtle but crucial. The social cost of not attending church has largely disappeared. 30 years ago, if you were a professional in a southern town and didn't attend church, people noticed. It could affect your business relationships, your social standing, even your employment prospects in some cases. People would ask where you went to church, and answering nowhere marked you as an outsider, as someone potentially untrustworthy. That pressure largely no longer exists in most places, especially in urban and suburban areas. There are now enough non-attenders that it's socially acceptable to skip church. You won't be shunned. You won't lose business opportunities. You won't be whispered about. This removes one of the key mechanisms that maintained high church attendance, even among people who weren't particularly devout. When church attendance was expected, people went even if they weren't especially interested. Now that it's optional, they simply don't. The loss of church control in the South isn't just about religion. It represents a fundamental restructuring of Southern society and culture. For generations, churches were community centers, social networks, and power structures all rolled into one. They determined social norms, shaped political outcomes, and created the fabric of community life. That era is ending, and it's not clear what's replacing it. Some of that community function has moved online, to social media groups and virtual communities. Some has moved to secular organizations, to sports leagues and hobby groups. Some has simply vanished, leaving people more isolated and communities more fragmented. The decline of church isn't just about where people spend Sunday mornings. It's about the erosion of institutions that connected people, created shared identities, and gave communities coherence. Politically, the implications are enormous. Southern politics for most of the 20th century revolved around church leadership and church communities. Politicians courted pastors, showed up at church events, and used religious language to connect with voters. The religious right, emerging in the late 1970s and dominating Republican politics since the Reagan era, was built on mobilizing Southern church congregations. As those churches decline, as younger Southerners become less religious, the political landscape is shifting. We've already seen this in some areas. Georgia, a state that was reliably Republican for decades, flipped blue in 2020, driven partly by younger, more diverse, less religious voters in Atlanta's suburbs. North Carolina and Texas are increasingly competitive. Virginia has already transitioned from red to purple to blue, following a similar demographic pattern. The South is still more religious than the rest of the country, still more conservative, but the gap is narrowing. What does the future hold? If current trends continue, and there's no reason to think they won't, the South in 2050 will be religiously unrecognizable compared to the South of 1950 or even 2000. Church membership will likely continue declining. More churches will close or consolidate. The ones that survive will be either large, well-funded institutions in urban areas or small, intensely committed congregations that function more like social clubs than mass movements. Christianity will remain present, but it won't dominate the culture the way it once did. It won't be the default setting for Southern identity. Younger generations are creating a different kind of South, one that's more diverse, more connected to the rest of the country, less bound by traditional institutions and hierarchies. This transformation is painful for many people, especially older Southerners who grew up when church was central to everything. They're watching a world they understood where everyone shared certain basic assumptions about God, morality, and community, being replaced by something more fragmented, more uncertain, more individualistic. They feel like they're losing their culture, and in a sense, they're right. But culture always changes. What feels like loss to one generation is freedom to another. What looks like decline from one perspective looks like progress from another. If you found this deep dive into Southern religious change valuable, if you appreciate the research and storytelling we put into Professor Archive, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us continue creating detailed, thoughtful content on the historical and cultural forces that shape our world. And of course, subscribe if you haven't already, because we've got many more stories to tell. The South's churches aren't disappearing entirely, but their control over Southern culture, politics, and social life is crumbling. The Bible Belt is being unbuckled. What emerges in its place is still being written, shaped by the choices of millions of individuals deciding whether Sunday morning means church, brunch, or sleeping in.